2019. This is Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. My name is Dr. Brad Reedy, and tonight we're going to be talking about autism spectrum disorder. So, for those of you who may have a loved one that has this disorder, you might know some of the things that I'm talking about tonight. But as always, even if it's not something in your family, I'm going to talk about, I think, things that are practical takeaways for any parent of any child who might be struggling. Because I think that one of the most common questions I get asked by the parents of clients who have autism spectrum disorder is anything applicable to them that I'm talking about? Because oftentimes I'm talking about 12-step meetings, I'm talking about addiction recovery, mental illness in terms of depression, eating disorders, cutting, suicidality, anxiety, those types of things. And somehow this fits into a category that I think other people that people think that doesn't apply to them. And there are differences. One of the themes tonight is going to be there are differences with this disorder and with other disorders. And at the same time, there still are some common principles that apply to every parent. Let me talk. I'm going to get a little bit clinical and text heavy for the first couple of slides as I talk about the disorder. And I took this from the diagnostic manual and from the Center for Disease Control. So I'll just talk about it, and I tried to edit it down as well as I can so it wasn't too heavy, too dense, but I need to give you some context. So autism spectrum disorder, that's a new way of describing a few different things that we used to talk about a few years ago. We would talk about autism, we would talk about nonverbal learning disabilities on the other end of the autistic spectrum disorder continuum, and then we would talk about Asperger's being somewhere in between. And so they've erased nonverbal learning disabilities from the diagnostic manual and Asperger's, which in a sense is a good thing because it makes it much more simple. And it is a continuum. I'm not going to talk about low functioning autism today. I mean, I might make some reference to it, but that's not what we treat. We treat people that can appear at times to look and sound mainstream, can kind of pass for it, but they still have some of the neurological differences that are a part of ASD or autism spectrum disorder. So let's start with that. This contains persistent deficits in social communication and social interactions across multiple contexts. So I think for those of us who think that some of the disorders that are present today have just shown up on the scene, this is extra what we might have called in previous decades somebody who was a nerd or socially awkward. I don't want to use anything that would be stigmatizing, but that's how we thought of it a long time ago. Somebody that was different, and characterized by these characteristics. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect. Or as far as failure to initiate or respond to social interaction. So they're not responsive to other people. It doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel easy. If you're not on the autism spectrum disorder, it's going to feel like something's off. And I think, like a lot of things, if we don't interpret these things through the ASD lens, we start to project onto individuals who have this disorder. We start to project onto them things that aren't true, right? We apply kind of an intent or maybe passive aggressive behavior, right? Those are kinds of the way that things can look, but there's not a reading, there's not a social depth there. They're not wired to read human face, nonverbals, all the subtleties of communication. They don't, so therefore they don't respond to it. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and the use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. So as it gets more significant, or in some individuals, they can't read emotion on your face. And because most of us count so much on feedback from other people, they're going to be non-responsive to it. It's not because of a willful or a rebellious disregard for other people. It's not traditionally what we would think of as a lack of empathy, right? That feels more like it could be cruel and uncaring. It's more robotic. More, it's a different kind of programming. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties to adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or making friends, the absence of interest in peers. They're not abstract thinkers. They don't get metaphor. They don't get idioms. Idioms for them, they translate them as literal. Figures of speech become difficult for them to interpret because, again, everything is very little. You could almost think of them as processing it the way that maybe somebody from another country might process an idiom, right? They wouldn't understand the context and the subtleties of it. ASD contains a restrictive, repetitive behavior pattern. It's common. Interests or activities manifested by at least two of the following: stereotyped and repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech. So everything becomes very repetitive and can become what looks to be obsessive. It's an obsessive repetition. And to remove them and to not allow them for those repetitive behaviors or rituals causes a great deal of anxiety because that's a self soothing kind of thing for them. An insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Again, we've seen scenes in movies, those of us who might not have personal experience, where somebody with ASD was not allowed to follow their typical routine, and they can get incredibly out of control, dysregulated, even become violent because it's a threat to a sense of safety. When encountering, for example, law enforcement, it can be very tricky because the touch, the personal space, the confusion for them, and the lack of response to the law enforcement officer, the way that those without ASD would know to respond, can start to escalate significantly. They have highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity focus. So it's in some ways it's the opposite of ADHD. Somebody with ADHD can get distracted by anything, right? Something out of the side of their eye, the smallest or subtle, most subtle cue from the environment can change their focus. Whereas somebody with ASD is going to be focused to a fault. Now, what that also often gives them is some kind of genius. Sometimes they can focus. They can have a capacity to focus on something so much that even musically, artistically, sometimes with computer or math or engineering, something like that, they can get incredibly focused on something. Hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So they're going to be uncomfortable with touch sometimes, some of them in some ways. At the same time, they could have a large piece of food that's sitting on their face and they wouldn't, their brain doesn't really register it. So it can be hypo or hypersensitivity to physical stimuli. Symptoms must be present early, at an early developmental period, but they might not become manifest until the demands of social interactions expose them. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. That description is just what every description in the diagnostic manual has, which is everybody is somewhere on the continuum of some of these things. But does it start to impair in one of the critical areas of life? And then, of course, these aren't explained by other intellectual impairments. So that's, I apologize for those of you who might know it or not interested in the kind of the small brushstrokes, but that's kind of the detailed description from the diagnostic manual. So let's talk more. Let's have more of a conversation about it. The special challenges with somebody that suffers from ASD. And I say, I even find myself stopping short of calling it a disorder and talking about it in terms of suffering, because in many ways, they're not suffering. The only suffering that happens is when we try to fit the square peg into the round hole. right? It only is in a context where they suffer and they struggle. And when that context is unable to adjust or to accommodate for them, then it can become very emotionally dysregulating. So they're going to struggle with peer relations, right? They're going to struggle with all relationships. It's probably going to start with you. I'll say this, and I'm going to say this again at the end. It's really important. If you have a child or a loved one that has ASD, you're going to need support because the neurology is so different from yours. It's going to be frustrating, upsetting. It's going to stretch you. You're going to have to find some resources, education or emotional outlets for you to take care of yourself because it can be taxing. Now, it can also be absolutely beautiful, and that transformation that we go through when we have to adjust to somebody else, no matter what their differences are, can be amazing and a spiritual opening up of our lives. That's true, but it can be difficult. And so I just want to mention that you need help, you need support, you need resources emotionally and educationally. Executive functioning, they're not going to be able to track things. The things are going to be disorganized, messy. They're going to be forgetful. They're not going to be able to adjust to information on the fly. Like I said, emotional regulation. That's why it can look like anxiety. It can look like even oppositionality. It can look like other things because when their routines are interrupted or when they're stimulated in a way where they have a sensitivity to it, they can become very dysregulated. Nonverbal processing deficits, like I said, they're not going to be able to process. Part of it comes when, even if their nonverbal scores, their abstract thinking processes aren't as low as you might imagine, but when there's a split, when their verbal skills, I mean, think about that. That makes sense, right? We know people, even if not personally, we know that archetype, that character from a movie who is incredibly verbal, and yet their social skills lag behind. And while their social skills might not be on the lowest end of things, the split makes it apparent. Self-care, this is a big thing out in the wilderness. Self-care, because that's a part of executive functioning, being able to hygiene, being able to take care of themselves from a safety or hygiene perspective can be challenging. Transitions are very difficult because, again, we talk about routines, predictability, right? Keeping them inside of their comfort zone. Transitions are going to be difficult for them. One of the things that we talk about in treating somebody who has ASD is to give them time to prepare, to tell them what we're going to be doing in the future, to give them a front loading of an assignment or a group that we're going to be having later. The like I've already talked about, the sensory integration issues with food, with clothing, with touch, with noise, all of that can be very, very disrupting for them emotionally. They're going to have difficulty in communicating with you and with others. Um, like I said, figures of speech, abstractions, those are going to be difficult. I'm going to talk about some traditional treatments that the CDC recommends, and then I'm going to talk about wilderness therapy, and then I'm going to talk about you. So the CDC recommends or acknowledges ABA, applied behavioral analysis, which encourages positive behaviors and discourages negative behaviors in an order to improve a variety of skills. It's just simple behavior modification. More than the rest of our program by far, we think about behavioral modification, shaping behaviors, rewarding successive approximations in behaviors, which means not the absolute perfection of the behavior, but a step towards it. There are different kinds of ABA. DTT is a style of teaching that uses a series of trials to teach each step of the desired behavior. Lessons are broken down into their simplest parts. So again, this is taking the small parts and giving them, whereas you might be able to think of several things at once, you might be able to conceptualize the big picture. They have microscopic kind of vision. So we're going to break things up into small parts. And then you on top of that, apply the behavioral principles for improvements in their behavior. Early intensive behavioral intervention, or EIBI, is a type of ABA for very young children, so we're not going to talk about that. Um, Pivotal response training aims at increasing a child's motivation to learn, monitor his own behavior, and initiate communication with the others. So all of them are some form of behavioral reinforcement, focusing on really training them. You're kind of training them how to interact with other people and their environment. Verbal behavior intervention, which relates to our communication skills training, focuses on teaching verbal skills. So why does it work in wilderness? What do we do? It's very structured. As you know, if you've been out there or had your trials with us, there are routines, there are schedules, there's jargon, there's rotating chores. Everything becomes, even for the non ASD client or student, it becomes kind of a routine that you get comfortable with. There's live social skills training opportunities. That's one of the effective things about wilderness therapy, is that it's not abstract. You're problem solving. You're dealing with conflict resolution in the moment. And so you're doing constantly, with all of our groups, constantly training social skills. There's a limited range of activities, right? There aren't dozens of people in their context, right, that they get exposed to. They don't have a lot of activities. School is minimized, right? Going out in the world, going shopping, driving somewhere, all of that stuff is removed, and it becomes a very simple environment. It also happens to be why it's effective with our other students, but for them, it's indicated that the fewer, the less the field of stimulation, the better off they are. High staff to student ratio, of course, allows us. It goes back to that idea again of not having resources emotionally, because it's not like raising a child without ASD. It's not the same like it is with a lot of our clients, right? They require more resources, but it's a particular drain because it's frustrating and there's no insight and there seems to be no progress. So you have to change your expectation. So the high staff to student ratio helps. Positive peer culture, right? It's not just the adults in the room that are doing the teaching, but all of the peers. The I feel statements, the communication theory that we teach, it approximates the training that the CDC talks about. They start to build competency and experience success in the environment. There's a relationship focus in wilderness. That's a part of the process. The small group sizes, again, it's kind of like young childhood. See, when you're small, your parents are your siblings are your whole world. At our age, our world consists of dozens, hundreds, thousands of people in some cases. And so the small group sizes brings it back to an earlier developmental stage, so to speak, and you're dealing with those same people. Lessons can be followed through on, can be reinforced, can be repeated. Managing countertransference, what that means is the reaction that a therapist has to a client. And countertransference, kind of toxic countertransference, is any feeling toward the client like frustration, annoyance, impatient, anger, anxiety, fear. Those are all problematic countertransference. Now, they're only problematic if they're not dealt with. If they're seen and dealt with, it actually can be informative. It can be diagnostic. It can tell you, can give you a glimpse into that person's world or the family. But if not treated, it can become a problem. Non-countertransference is compassion, patience, and curiosity. So if you're responding to somebody patiently, with compassion, and with curiosity, it's said that you are adequately containing them. You're holding space for them. So managing countertransference in the wilderness is something that we do well. Self-care, right? There's practice and repetition at taking care of yourself with, of course, significant intervention so that they're safe. The small groups, the slowing down of the process, right? There aren't a lot of tasks to get accomplished in a day, at least not the variety of them that we all experience in our day-to-day world. And then there are accommodations, finding the line. This is the greatest challenge of almost every parent, and specifically when your child is atypical, neurologically speaking. Finding the line between making accommodations and holding somebody accountable, right? Rewarding positive behavior, discouraging negative behavior. Globally, we're looking to utilize effective learning theory principles. Like I said, behavior shaping, successive approximation, fading, and extinction. We're trying to set up small scenarios where they start to feel success. There is so much academic abuse in our culture. That is somebody who has a learning difference, a learning disability, and receive messages from the environment that something's wrong with them on a human level. And that really does impact self-esteem, can lead to other comorbid, right, co-occurring mental health disorders and behaviors. Um, the find things that the student can do to be important to the group, right? Finding their niche. If they have microscopic focus, find something that they can be successful at. Lots of positive lots of positive reinforcement. I saw a statistic recently about the tens of thousands of times more that somebody that has ADHD gets critical feedback than other students without ADHD before the age of 18. Tens of thousands of more critical messages. And that's going to be true of somebody with ASD also. So it takes an effort to try to focus on, it's like rewarding a child, right? A developmentally appropriately growing child. You're going to reward your young child with enthusiasm, with being able to tie their shoes, whereas you're not going to reward your 18-year-old who doesn't have a learning difference that they're tying their shoes. So you've got to adjust and your expectations and really focus on the positive. Choose your battles. That's probably, it's true of all parenting. Again, there's a lot of these things that can be applied, but with ASD, it's critical. I call some clients, not necessarily only ASD clients, I call them target rich. It means there are so many things in a given week or in a given session that I could focus on that need attention, that could benefit from attention, that I have to choose just two or three. If I focus on all 15, 20, or 30, and the way that they're presenting in all of those ways, it's just going to be overwhelming for them. Same and even more profoundly as a parent. Managing your countertransference. That means, again, are you feeling patient, compassionate, and curious? It's not limited to those three, but it gives you an idea about what I'm talking about. If you're not, then you have to do something to find that space. Time out, self-care, resources, education, hiring somebody if you have that resource available to you to help you. Educating students, getting somebody an awareness of what their learning difference is can be really helpful. They can advocate for themselves. They can recognize other people's reactions to them and explain what it's like for them. Of course, working with the staff and giving you parents. Most of you who, if you have this diagnosis in your life, you kind of know some of this stuff. But for some of you, it might be new. Maybe they were on the higher functioning end of the autism spectrum disorder continuum. And if that's true, this might be the first time that you're considering it. It might start to make sense. Let's talk about some specific intervention strategies to help with specific challenges that are present in ASD. First of all, peer relations. I'll talk about how we do it here. You can extrapolate that to home. Hold group members to high standards of emotional safety and preventing scapegoating. This can easily be a situation. It's easy to dogpile on somebody who has atypical neurological issues. Provide opportunities for positive attention. Use role modeling, right? That's one of the ways that you're training them is through role modeling. And take them out of the group if it becomes too much, if it becomes problematic. With regard to the executive functioning, like was described by the CDC, break things down into short-term goals, give them levels of prompting, meaning that you're breaking it down to prompt them to do things as you go along. Make lists for them. I've even seen staff draw out everything in somebody's pack on the sleeping pad that the child sleeps on, and then they list where it goes in the backpack. Use positive correction techniques, that rewarding successive approximations. Using the buddy system, sometimes a peer can shoulder some of the load if the peer is particularly patient. Include the tasks like making times, keeping with your staff, and time management a part of the treatment plan. You're trying to give them training and practice in executive functioning. With regard to emotional regulation, you start to teach them about feelings and what they are and what they look like. Sometimes it's the charts with the faces, right? That can be very helpful with somebody for somebody with ASD. Learning the I feel statements, teaching them about taking their own timeouts when it gets overwhelming, rewarding successful approximations. Don't, in other words, instead of having a tamper, we did this all the time. We have students that go from having reaction episodes 5 times a day that last all day to having them a few times a day and recovering quickly. We pay a lot of attention and reward that. Don't be surprised if somebody with ASD gets over something really quickly. It's like there's a lack of depth and breadth of emotions in them, so they're going to go through it really quickly and rapidly and rationally. Sometimes a lot of us could use that, could get a little of that ourselves. Use an intellectual approach to solving problems, logical, rational problem solving, right? It's more teaching and training than other kinds of therapy. With nonverbal learning or processing deficits, provide instructions verbally, have them reflect things back to you, have them observe activities and write down steps. Like I said, drawing things on their, labeling things about where they go can be really helpful. Some of them might struggle with drawing because their motor dexterity can be challenged sometimes. They're going to have a hard time with that. It's for some. Self-care, make it a part of the treatment plan. That's part of our treatment plan. And again, we want to keep them safe, so there has to be extra supervision assigned to the client, to the student. With regard to transitions, engage them in the idea of why it's important to learn to hit a curveball, right? You're educating them about them and their life and how they're adjusting to it. You're going to be a little bit more flexible with FI, what we call FI, or future information. And don't expect perfection. Allow for some variation. With regard to the sensory integration issues, be aware that loud noises, large amounts of stimulation, or even small amounts of tactile stimulation can be very aversive and overwhelming. So those are things we can easily accommodate. Don't discount it. It can be very frustrating. It can be time intensive. It's like dealing in that one area with a younger child, and that can be very challenging. Choose your battles, especially with regard to food. They're going to have rituals and limitations around the breadth of food. They're not going to want certain foods to mix together. They might not like certain colors in their foods, and that's going to take extra work and creativity to work around for you. Difficulty with abstraction. Don't use metaphor, or use it very limited, and if you do, talk about it. Be very concrete and explain anything that is symbolic. Here's some comments from some of our therapists. Clinical responses. Wilderness is an effective treatment milieu for ASD. The merging of social and therapy world provides the opportunity for regular and meaningful peer feedback about their relationships in the moment. This is the kind of feedback few people get in their regular social world. Regular feedback and teaching about social relationships helps ASD kids build their rule book and develop a more sophisticated understanding of how to engage in relationships. Our ASD kids often talk about creating something like a library of experiences. They create tons of if-then situations and tag them with worked well or worked bad. They then reference the library in new situations and make their best guess about how to proceed. Wilderness then provides the opportunity to really build up the library. So we take so much of our learning in these ways for granted, and they cannot, and that's okay. Therapy will not change how the way that their brain works, but it can help somebody with ASD understand how their brain works. And then when that's understood, there can be accommodations and workarounds. Understanding both deficits and strengths will allow them to be more effective in managing the world. And while the ASD group that we have struggles at times, it suffers greatly. It can look like somebody with an attachment disorder, and that makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense because, in a sense, there's an inability to kind of experience the same kind of bonding as another. And if you have a child with ASD, it can be hard to show that kind of warmth. There's no crime or sin in that. It's just human nature. Evoke becomes a safe place that can provide near constant emotional safety. Cycles of peer rejection and isolation are interrupted. Students are supported and resources previously designated for defense become available for development. Emotional safety is critical in order for the students to become more open, aware, and willing to develop improved skills. So the cycles of peer interaction behavior, the emotional safety is really important. What are the take-homes? Again, as you can hear this, some of this applies to all of you, even if you don't have ASD in your life. ASD is considered a neurobiological difference. It is not a show of simple opposition, nor the result of poor parenting. Children with ASD usually have strong verbal skills, but are more literal and concrete in their processing. These children are usually rigid and reactive in their processing of information and struggle to generalize life experiences into meaningful contexts. Their concrete processing and reactive response leaves them a natural target for bullying and rejection of peers. Isn't that the truth? Treatment of ASD is complicated and requires a unique balance of patience, deliver clear and constant interpersonal boundaries, and some behavior modification, and the ability to connect emotionally with those with whom it can be most difficult to connect. Like I said, the most important take home, in my opinion, is get support. Emotional, training, educational support. This is hard. Wilderness therapy has become a powerful and effective way to help teens with ASDs or young adults to begin to experience successes. So try to focus on the positive. Try to generalize that at home. Provide clear, consistent expectations that, when learned, give them a sense of competence, accomplishment. Figuring out your line. I mean, I talk about this all the time. I'm going to digress a little bit because figuring out accommodations is not that different from every question that every parent has. How much of this do I challenge in my child? And how much of in this context or this area do they need extra support from me? Am I enabling or am I supporting? And the answer to that question for everybody else is a lot of personal introspection, right? Knowing yourself and then having that decision come out of your truth, what you feel is right for you. What you add to the equation with the parent of an ASD child is education and specific understanding about their neurology, about the way that they present neurologically. Having the child on a spectrum is like having a child with drug abuse issues, addiction, depression, anxiety, and ODD. Some things are the same and some things are different. So when we ask you to go to 12-step meetings like Al-Anon or CODA, the content of what is being shared is not going to be relatable to you. But what is relatable is you love somebody who's struggling and suffering in life, who thinks differently than you do, who's difficult at times to love, who does things that hurt you or that hurt themselves. And so how do I relate to that person? How can I be me and love them? and have both those things be happening as often as possible. So yeah, I do think that they can be helpful, and getting a little bit of extra support from organizations like NAMI.org, local chapter. I also listed on here the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. It has a website to help individuals with ASD, people that struggle with communication. The Autism Treatment Network, ATN, also seeks to create standards of medical treatment that will be more broadly available to physicians, researchers, parents, policymakers, and others who want to improve the care of those with autism. So that's a lot of facts tonight, probably appropriate given what we're talking about as the diagnosis. And so if you have a child on the spectrum, you have a lot in common with all the rest of the parents, and you have some things that are different. And I think the important parenting skills, the ones that are really at the heart of this work, are the ones you have in common. The small brush strokes, the small details, the small examples, those are different. But no matter what, it's going to take a great deal of emotional and intellectual capacity on your part. So get the support that you need. All right. I hope that's helpful for those of you that might just be coming into this. Any questions? Looks like there are no questions. I'm going to go over upcoming support groups and activities. I will be in London October 6th. If you have anybody that you know in London, feel free to share this with them. I'll be at the Gielgud Theater. You have to RSVP to this event. I'll be in Chicago on October 27th. That's a Sunday, 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. You can contact Melanie at evoketherapy.com for information or to RSVP to these events. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, the next intensive that's available is October 23rd. Go to our website to find out about our individual, family, and couples intensives. In fact, next week I'm going to be talking about that on this broadcast. I'm really looking forward to that. If you want to find out about our Pursuits programs, which are outdoor adventure programs all over the world, therapy light, sober fun, kind of reconnecting to growth and esteem and healing and mindfulness. You can do it as a family or individuals. You can set up, if they're all custom made for whatever kind of adventure activities you would like to do, whitewater rafting, fishing, canyoning, climbing, any kind of adventure activity you can imagine. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups at least. Some combination of Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous. I like adultchildren.org also. Adult Children is a great program to go to find out what it was like in your family. Alateen is for teens. RefugeRecovery.org is a program for people that might be more inclined toward a non-higher power focused recovery program, mindfulness, Buddhist inspired. Like I mentioned earlier, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI.org, is a great resource to go to get free or affordable resources in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app on your iPhone using the podcast app, on an Android device using the SoundCloud app, or on SoundCloud.com. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find Evoke Therapy programs using the handle @EvokeTherapy, or you can find the Summit Lodge using the handle @EvokeSummitLodge on Instagram. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs, or the Foundation you can find by searching Evoke Family Foundation if you want to make a contribution or see how you can get involved in an organization to help people who can't afford therapy. The Evoke Therapy blog is a great resource. My first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is also available on Amazon, where you can also get digital versions or audio versions. Any other questions come in? Looks like no questions tonight. And that's okay. So I hope you'll join me this coming Monday. I'm going to give you a glimpse more into what our intensives looks like, what's involved, what kind of programming, and then really walk you through a little bit of theoretically why I think they are one of the most, if not the most important thing you can do to help your child, is for you alone to attend one of our intensives, specifically finding you. That'll be this Monday, September 23rd at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. So I look forward to that. Very excited about that. I hope this is a helpful introduction to those of you that are watching or listening to this recorded. For those of you that might be listening live, I hope it's a nice point of contact. And if you have it in your life, maybe it added something. If you don't have it in your life, maybe you can start to see the similarities. And you might have somebody in your life who has been undiagnosed with this disorder, that it starts to make sense why they seem to be processing and reacting differently. So it's an interesting. I'll just say this before I close. Amy Schumer, the comedian, said that she realized after she married her husband, and they haven't been married that long, that he had autism spectrum disorder. He was on the spectrum, and she said she didn't want to divorce him. She loves him. She loves having him in her life, but she adjusted her expectation around certain things. And she didn't translate everything through her brain, right? She looked at it through the autism spectrum disorder lens. And then it doesn't get interpreted as a lack of love. The same way that an addiction, somebody with an addiction, if we interpret it the same way that you and I might, or somebody with depression, the way that we might not experience life, the way that somebody who's depressed, if we just look at it through our eyes, through our lens, we're going to misinterpret what's going on for everybody else. Depression is not sadness. It's not easy to make the choices to get out of it. Addiction is not willpower, solved by willpower. It's solved by something called surrender. And those kinds of ideas, you can start to see how no matter what the diagnosis of your loved one is, we have to learn to see other as other. It's like that quote that I've shared before, which is, the first thing that you should know about me is that I'm not you. And everything else will make a lot more sense after that. So I hope it's helpful to you as a point of contact tonight, no matter where you are. Take care, folks. I'll talk to you this Monday, the 23rd of September at 7, about our Evoke Therapy Program intensives. Take care. Bye-bye.